Nothing says happy marriage like a wife who spends more time fixing her parents' sink than she does talking to you. But that's exactly what I told myself when Allison called at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, her voice breathless and urgent. Vic, honey, I'm so sorry to call this late. I'm staying at my parents' house tonight. Dad's having issues with the plumbing again, and Mom's practically in tears. You know how she gets. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I sat up in bed, squinting at the clock. At midnight? Couldn't this wait until morning? The pipe burst in their basement. There's water everywhere. I couldn't just leave them to deal with it alone. Victor Harper, that's me, 38 years old. IT manager at a mid-sized tech company and apparently married to the most devoted daughter in suburban Chicago. At least, that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 3 months as these late-night emergencies became more frequent. Okay, I said, rubbing my eyes. Do you need me to come help? No, I've got it handled. I'll probably crash here tonight and head straight to work in the morning. Love you. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone for a long moment, that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same knot I'd been ignoring since Allison started taking those extra long showers when she came home, or checking her phone with the screen tilted away from me, or suddenly developing a passionate interest in her parents' home maintenance issues. See, here's the thing about lies. They're like cheap paint. They look fine from a distance, but get up close and you can see all the cracks and bubbles underneath. The next morning, I called Eddie Martinez, my best friend since college and the most reliable electrician in Cook County. If anyone would know about emergency plumbing situations in our neighborhood, it would be Eddie. Hey man, I said, trying to sound casual. You hear anything about the Monroes having plumbing issues? Major pipe burst or something? The Monroes on Maple Street? Allison's parents? Eddie's voice crackled through his Bluetooth headset. Nah, nothing. Actually saw Mr. Monroe yesterday at the hardware store buying fertilizer for his lawn. Seemed pretty relaxed for a guy dealing with a flooded basement. That knot in my stomach pulled tighter. Why? Everything okay with you and Allison? Yeah, everything's fine, I lied, because that's what you do when your world starts tilting sideways. You pretend gravity still works the same way, but it doesn't. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Allison's emergency trips to her parents' house coincided perfectly with her sudden interest in working late, grabbing drinks with colleagues, and her newfound dedication to fitness. Specifically, the gym membership she'd purchased but never mentioned. I'm not a detective, but I'm not an idiot either. When your wife starts lying about where she spends her nights, there are really only a few possibilities, and none of them involve plumbing. The breakthrough came courtesy of Gloria Hendricks, our next-door neighbor, and the unofficial surveillance system for our entire block. Gloria was 63, retired, and had elevated nosiness to an art form. She also happened to be watering her garden when I got home from work on a Thursday evening. Oh, Vic, she called out, waving her garden hose like a weapon. How are Allison's parents doing with all their house troubles? They're managing, I said carefully. That's good to hear, though I have to say, it's odd that she's been parking that little Honda of hers over on Birch Street so often. You'd think if she was helping her parents, she'd park in their driveway. Birch Street, 3 blocks away from the Monroe's house, right next to the Sunset Motel. Gloria, I said, walking closer to the fence. How often have you seen her car there? Her eyes lit up with the joy of someone who'd been waiting weeks for this exact question. Oh, honey. At least twice a week for the past month. Always in the evening, always gone by morning. I only noticed because I take my walks through that neighborhood. That red Mustang is always parked right next to it. Red Mustang. I thanked Gloria and went inside, my hands shaking slightly as I poured myself a whiskey. Not because I was shocked, I'd known, on some level, for weeks, but because now I had to decide what to do about it. Some men might have confronted their wives immediately, others might have hired a private investigator or started screaming. But I'm a methodical person. When there is a problem in the system, you don't just start randomly deleting files. You trace the bug back to its source, understand how it got there, and then you fix it properly. So I decided to run a little test. The next evening, I called Allison at work. Hey, babe, I was thinking of inviting your parents over for dinner this weekend. It's been too long since we've seen them. There was a pause. A long pause. Oh, that's sweet of you, Vic, but they're really overwhelmed with everything going on at the house right now, maybe in a few weeks. I'm sure they could use a break from all that stress. How about Saturday night? I'll cook that pot roast your dad loves. I don't think this weekend is good. Mom mentioned they might need to have the contractor come look at the foundation. The foundation? I thought it was plumbing. Another pause. It is, but the water damage might have affected the foundation. Look, I'm in a meeting. Can we talk about this later? She hung up. I immediately called the Monroe house. Mrs. Monroe answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and relaxed. Vic, how lovely to hear from you. How are you and Allison doing? We're great, Mrs. Monroe. I was actually calling to see if you and Mr. Monroe would like to come over for dinner Saturday night. I know you've been dealing with a lot of house problems lately, and I thought you might enjoy a break. House problems? She sounded genuinely confused. What house problems? My heart started pounding. The plumbing issues? The burst pipe in the basement? Oh, honey, I think there's been some misunderstanding. We haven't had any plumbing problems. In fact, Bob just finished renovating the basement last month. It's never looked better. The room started spinning slightly. Mrs. Monroe, has Allison been staying with you recently, helping with repairs? Allison? No, dear. We haven't seen Allison in over a month. Is everything all right? I managed to end the conversation without completely falling apart, but just barely. Once I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall and processing the full scope of my wife's deception. She wasn't just cheating, she was using her parents, the people who loved and trusted her, as unwitting accomplices in her lies. She was counting on me never checking her story, never calling them directly, never questioning her devotion to family. That's when I realized this wasn't just about infidelity. This was about complete and utter disrespect. For me, for her parents, for our marriage, for basic human decency. And that's when I decided that Allison was about to learn a very important lesson about what happens when you use people who love you as shields for your lies. But first, I needed to know exactly who she was lying for. The Red Mustang belonged to Dan Miller, sales rep at Hartley Communications, 2 towns over. It took me exactly 47 minutes of internet searching to figure that out, cross-referencing Gloria's description with the Sunset Motel's parking lot during my lunch break reconnaissance mission. Dan Miller, 33 years old, divorced, drove a car that screamed midlife crisis, and apparently had a thing for married women who lied about plumbing emergencies. I found his LinkedIn profile, his Facebook page, and even his Instagram account, which was filled with gym selfies and motivational quotes about living your best life and taking what you deserve. Real philosopher, this guy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the moment I decided to become the kind of person who conducts lunch break surveillance missions. It was Friday morning, 18 hours after my conversation with Mrs. Monroe, and Allison was getting ready for work like nothing had happened. She stood at the bathroom mirror, applying lipstick with the kind of care usually reserved for special occasions. Working late again tonight? I asked from the bedroom. Probably. We've got that big presentation on Monday, and Jennifer wants to run through it one more time. Jennifer, her boss, who I'd met at 3 different company parties and who had never once mentioned any big presentations or late-night work sessions. Maybe I'll swing by around 7 with some coffee for you and the team, I suggested. Allison's hand froze for just a moment. Just a moment, but I caught it. That's sweet, honey, but we'll probably order pizza. You know how Jennifer gets when there are too many distractions during crunch time. She kissed my cheek and left for work, trailing a cloud of the expensive perfume she'd started wearing recently, the perfume I'd never bought her. That's when I called Eddie. I need a favor, I said when he answered. And I need you to not ask questions until I'm ready to explain everything. Shit, Vic, what kind of favor? The kind where you help me figure out if my wife is cheating on me. There was a long silence. Then, I'll be right over. Eddie Martinez was the kind of friend every man should have. Loyal, practical, and completely incapable of sugarcoating bad news. He was also built like a linebacker, which hadn't been relevant to our friendship until now, but was somehow comforting given the circumstances. He arrived at my house 20 minutes later with a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. Okay, he said, settling into my kitchen chair. Tell me everything. So I did. The late-night calls, the plumbing lies, Gloria's intelligence about the Red Mustang, my conversation with Mrs. Monroe, everything. Eddie listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of disgust. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Jesus, Vic, I'm sorry. I need to know for sure, I said, and I need to know who. You want to hire a private investigator? No, I want to catch them myself. Eddie studied my face. Why? Because when this is over, I want her to know that I'm not the clueless husband she thought I was. I want her to understand exactly how thoroughly she underestimated me. And then what? I smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. Then I'm going to return the favor. We spent the next hour planning what Eddie called Operation Plumbing Emergency. The plan was simple. Follow Allison after work, document whatever we found, and gather enough evidence to confront her with absolute certainty. But first, I wanted to meet Dan Miller. I found him at Powerhouse Gym on the north side of town, exactly where his Instagram check-ins suggested he'd be every Friday at 5:30 p.m. He was easy to spot, red Mustang in the parking lot, and the kind of guy who grunted loudly enough during bench presses to ensure everyone in a 50-foot radius knew he was working out. He was also exactly the type of man I'd expected. Tall, conventionally handsome in a generic way, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to work very hard for anything. The kind of man who saw a married woman as a challenge rather than a person. I waited until he finished his set, then approached the bench next to his. "Mind if I work in?" I asked. He looked me up and down, taking in my less than impressive physique and clearly determining I wasn't worth worrying about. "Sure, man. Go ahead." I loaded significantly less weight onto the bar and started my set. After a few reps, I struck up a conversation. "Nice Mustang out there. The red one?" His face lit up with pride. "Thanks, man. 2019 GT? Just got her detailed." "Beautiful car. I bet it gets a lot of attention." "You know it," he grinned. "Especially from the ladies." "I bet. You married?" "Divorced. Best decision I ever made. Now I'm free to enjoy life, you know? No more nagging, no more having to check in with anyone. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want." "Sounds liberating." "Oh, it is. And let me tell you, there are a lot of unhappy wives out there looking for someone who knows how to treat them right." I finished my set and sat up, looking at him directly. "Married women, huh? Isn't that a little complicated?" "Nah, man. It's perfect. They're not looking for commitment, just excitement, something their boring husbands can't give them." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I've got this one right now. Gorgeous, sweet, tells her husband she's helping her parents with house repairs." He laughed. Guy's so clueless he actually believes it. The weight of the bar suddenly felt insignificant compared to the rage building in my chest. But I kept my voice level, interested. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out." "I do. And the best part? When it's over, they go back to their boring lives, and I move on to the next one. No drama, no complications." I stood up, extending my hand. "I'm Mike, by the way." "Dan." He shook my hand, his grip firm and confident. "Well, Dan, I hope it all works out for you." "It always does, man. It always does." I left the gym with everything I needed to know about Dan Miller's character and a burning desire to show him exactly how wrong he was about complications. That night, I sat in my car across from the Sunset Motel and waited. At 7:23 p.m., Allison's Honda pulled into the parking lot, followed 30 seconds later by Dan's red Mustang. I watched them meet in the parking lot, watched her laugh at something he said, watched him put his hand on the small of her back as they walked toward room 237. I took pictures. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because I wanted her to see herself through my eyes when the time came. I wanted her to see how small and sordid her grand romance looked from the outside. They stayed for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When they came out, Allison looked relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. She kissed Dan goodbye, a long, passionate kiss that made my stomach turn, and then got in her car and drove home. I beat her there by 15 minutes, just enough time to pour myself a drink and pretend to be watching television when she walked through the door. "Hey, honey," she said, breezing into the living room. "How was your evening?" "Quiet. How was the presentation prep?" "Exhausting. Jennifer had us run through it 6 times. I'm beat." She yawned dramatically. "I think I'm going to shower and go straight to bed." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I listened to the water running upstairs and wondered how many lies a marriage could hold before it completely collapsed under the weight of them. But I wasn't ready to find out yet, because I had a much better idea. If Allison wanted to play games with the truth, I was going to show her how the game was really played. And unlike her, I wasn't going to need any lies to win. The Riverside Tavern was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, which made it perfect for what I had in mind. It was also where Allison and Dan had started meeting for drinks before graduating to the Sunset Motel, a fact I'd learned from Marcy Patterson, Allison's closest friend and unwitting intelligence source. Marcy had called me Tuesday morning, ostensibly to ask about Allison's birthday plans, but really to fish for information about our marriage. Marcy was the type of friend who lived vicariously through other people's drama, and she'd been sensing tension between Allison and me for weeks. "She seems stressed lately," Marcy had said. "All those late nights helping her parents, and then the work pressure on top of it. You should plan something special for her." "What work pressure?" I'd asked innocently. "Oh, all those client dinners and networking events." She mentioned she's been spending a lot of time at the Riverside Tavern with colleagues, building relationships. "Client dinners, networking events. At least Allison was consistent in her creativity. Which colleagues? I'd pressed. I don't know all of them. There's that guy Dan from some communications company. Seems nice enough, though a little too smooth for my taste. Bingo. That conversation had given me the final piece I needed for what Eddie was now calling the nuclear option. You sure about this, Vic? Eddie asked as we sat in my living room Wednesday evening, finalizing the details. Once you pull this trigger, there's no going back. I'm sure. And you're positive they'll be there Friday night? I showed him Allison's text from an hour earlier. Working late again Friday. Might grab drinks with the team afterward to unwind. Don't wait up? They'll be there, I said. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would organize an impromptu gathering at the Riverside Tavern for Friday night. Nothing fancy, just drinks with friends and neighbors to celebrate my recent promotion at work. A promotion that didn't exist, but that was a minor detail. I'd invite Eddie, Gloria, a few guys from work, some neighbors, and Marcy. I'd make sure word got around that it was a casual, drop-in kind of thing, the kind of event where people might show up unexpectedly. Then I'd wait for Allison and Dan to arrive for their romantic evening, completely unaware that they were walking into a room full of people who knew at least one of them very well. What if they see everyone and just leave? Eddie asked. They won't, I said. The Riverside has that entrance that leads straight to the back section where they usually sit. They'll be settled in with drinks before they realize what's happening. And then? Then I give a toast. Friday night arrived with all the anticipation of a natural disaster you can see coming but can't stop. I got to the Riverside at 6:30 and claimed the large table in the front section with a clear view of the back area where Allison and Dan typically sat. Eddie arrived first, followed by Gloria, who was practically vibrating with excitement despite not knowing exactly why she'd been invited. Then came my coworkers, Jim, Steve, and Marcus from IT, along with neighbors Pete and Susan from across the street. Marcy showed up at 7:15, looking around the growing crowd with confusion. "What's all this for?" she asked, sliding into the seat next to me. "Just felt like celebrating," I said. "Life's good, you know?" By 7:30, we had a solid group of 12 people, all in high spirits and completely unaware they were about to witness the social destruction of two people they thought they knew. At 7:47 p.m., Allison and Dan walked through the back entrance, just as I'd predicted. I watched them settle into their usual corner booth, watched Dan order what I now knew was his standard, whiskey neat, and watched Allison laugh at his jokes while sipping her wine. They looked comfortable, familiar, like a couple that had been together for months, which I realized they had been. "Excuse me for a minute," I told the table, standing up with my beer. I walked casually toward the back section, as if heading to the restroom. As I passed their booth, I made eye contact with Allison. The look on her face was everything I'd hoped for. Shock, terror, and the dawning realization that her two worlds were about to collide in spectacular fashion. "Allison," I said loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "What a surprise. I thought you were working late tonight." She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No sound came out. Dan, meanwhile, was looking between us with growing understanding and panic. "And you must be Dan," I continued, extending my hand. "I'm Vic, Allison's husband. I've heard so much about you." Dan's face went pale, but he shook my hand. "Nice to meet you. Funny running into you both here. Allison, you should come say hi to everyone. We're having an impromptu celebration up front." We were just," she stammered. "Nonsense. Dan, you should join us too. I insist." It wasn't really a request, and all three of us knew it. I guided them toward the front section, my hand on Allison's back in a gesture that probably looked friendly to observers but felt like a threat to her. "Everyone," I called out as we approached the table. "Look who I found, my wife Allison and her colleague Dan." The introductions were awkward, but not yet catastrophic. Gloria beamed at Allison, Marcy looked confused, and my coworkers made polite small talk with Dan about his work in communications. For about 10 minutes, it almost seemed like it might pass as a normal social encounter. Allison and Dan sat stiffly, barely speaking, while I played the role of gracious host. Then I stood up to make my toast. "I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight," I began, raising my beer. "It means a lot to have such good friends and neighbors here to celebrate with me." Everyone raised their glasses, smiling. "You know, marriage is about trust," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the bar. "It's about believing in each other, supporting each other, and being honest even when it's difficult." Allison's face was now completely white. "My wife Allison has been working so hard lately, staying late at the office, helping her parents with home repairs, networking with colleagues like Dan here. She's been so dedicated, so committed to doing the right thing." A few people nodded appreciatively. Gloria actually said, "Aw." In fact, she's been so busy with all these responsibilities that we barely see each other anymore. Just last week, she spent 3 nights helping her parents with a burst pipe in their basement. I turned to look directly at Allison. Isn't that right, honey? She nodded mutely. Of course, when I called your parents to invite them to dinner, they mentioned they haven't had any plumbing problems. In fact, they said they haven't seen you in over a month. The table went dead silent. But I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for that. Just like I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for why your car has been spotted in the Sunset Motel parking lot twice a week for the past month, always parked next to a red Mustang. Dan started to stand up, but Eddie, who had moved to stand behind him, put a firm hand on his shoulder. Sit down, Dan. We're not finished yet. You see, I continued, my voice still pleasant and conversational, I've learned a lot about trust lately. I've learned that some people think trust makes you weak, makes you gullible, makes you easy to fool. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery. But trust doesn't make you weak. It just makes you careful about who deserves it. I showed the phone to Marcy first. The photos from the motel parking lot were clear and damning. Allison and Dan kissing, embracing, walking hand in hand toward room 237. Marcy gasped and covered her mouth. I passed the phone around the table. Each person's reaction was a small masterpiece of shock and disgust. Gloria actually said, "Oh my stars," and fanned herself with a napkin. So here's to trust, I said, raising my glass again, and here's to learning who deserves it and who doesn't. Allison finally found her voice. Vic, please, let me explain. Explain what, exactly? How you've been using your parents as alibis for your affair? How you've been lying to my face every single day for months? How you've been making me feel crazy for suspecting what you were doing right in front of me? Dan tried to stand again, and this time Eddie let him. Look, man, I didn't know she was married when we started. Bullshit, I cut him off. You told me yourself at the gym last week how much you enjoy sleeping with married women, how you love that they lie to their clueless husbands about helping their parents. The entire bar was watching now. Other patrons had turned in their seats, sensing drama. You thought I was pathetic, I continued. Both of you did. The boring husband who actually believed his wife when she said she was fixing her parents' plumbing. Well, here's what this boring husband learned while you were laughing at him. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table. Dan, your landlord is very interested to know that you've been running an unlicensed business out of your apartment. All those sales calls you've been making, the ones where married women pay you cash for your consulting services, that's prostitution, Dan. Dan's face went from pale to green. That's not... I never... Allison, your boss Jennifer is fascinated to learn about all those late nights you've been billing as overtime while you were actually at the motel. That's fraud. And your HR department has some very strict policies about employees who lie on their timesheets. Allison started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic. You can't do this, she whispered. I already did. I sent copies of everything to your respective employers this afternoon, along with copies of the photos and a detailed timeline of your affair. I stood up and threw a 20 on the table. But don't worry. I'm sure you'll figure something out. After all, you're both so good at creative problem solving. I turned to address the table one last time. Thanks for coming, everyone. I think this celebration is over. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear the explosion of voices behind me. Gloria's shocked commentary, Marcy's angry questions, Eddie's laughter, and underneath it all, Allison's sobs and Dan's desperate attempts to explain himself to a room full of people who now knew exactly what kind of man he was. I stepped outside into the cool night air and took a deep breath. The best part wasn't the public humiliation, though that had been satisfying. The best part was the look on their faces when they realized I wasn't the man they thought I was. I wasn't the clueless husband who could be manipulated and deceived. I was the husband who had been 3 steps ahead of them the entire time, and I wasn't done yet. The fallout from the Riverside Tavern incident spread through our social circle like wildfire in a drought. By Saturday morning, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from people I hadn't heard from in months, all wanting to know if what they'd heard was true. Gloria, bless her gossipy heart, had apparently spent the entire night calling everyone she knew. By her account, emergencies, which I received via a detailed voicemail at 6:47 a.m., the story had grown to include details that weren't quite accurate, but were certainly entertaining. Vic, honey, I hope you're doing all right. I've been telling everyone what a dignified way you handled such an awful situation. Though I have to say, I had no idea that Dan character was running some kind of escort service. How shocking. Escort service, I almost laughed. By the time Gloria's version of events made its way through the neighborhood, Dan Miller was going to be some kind of criminal mastermind. But the real satisfaction came from a text I received from my coworker Jim at 8:15 a.m. Dude, saw Allison's car getting towed from the motel parking lot this morning. Guess she couldn't afford to get it out of impound after what happened last night. I hadn't arranged for her car to be towed, but apparently the Sunset Motel had a strict policy about vehicles left overnight without a registered guest. When Allison and Dan had fled the Riverside Tavern, they'd left her car behind in their panic. Small victories. Eddie showed up at my house around noon with coffee and donuts, looking like a man who'd enjoyed himself immensely the night before. You should have seen them after you left, he said, settling into my kitchen chair. Dan tried to explain to everyone that it wasn't what it looked like, but kind of hard to do when you've got photos of them making out in a motel parking lot. What did Allison do? Cried mostly. Kept saying she could explain everything, but when Marcy asked her to explain, she just cried harder. Eddie bit into a donut and shook his head. Marcy was pissed, by the way. Apparently Allison had been using her as an alibi, too, telling Dan that she was having girls' nights with Marcy when she was actually here with you. That was news to me, but it made sense. Allison had been playing all sides, using everyone in her life as unwitting accomplices in her deception. So, what's next? Eddie asked. Now we wait and see how they respond. I didn't have to wait long. At 2:30 p.m., Allison's key turned in the front door. She walked into the living room looking like she'd been hit by a truck, red eyes, rumpled clothes, and the kind of defeated posture that comes from having your entire life explode in public. We need to talk, she said quietly. Do we? She sat down on the edge of the couch, as far from me as possible. Vic, I know you're angry. Angry? I interrupted. Allison, I'm not angry. Angry is what you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic. This is something else entirely. I made a mistake. No. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or burning dinner. What you did was make a calculated decision to betray our marriage every single day for months. She started crying again, but I felt nothing. The tears that might have moved me 6 months ago just looked like manipulation now. It didn't mean anything, she whispered. It meant enough for you to lie to your parents about it. It meant enough for you to use them as alibis. It meant enough for you to steal money from our joint account to pay for motel rooms. Her head snapped up. What? I pulled out the bank statements I'd printed that morning. $60 every Tuesday and Friday for the past 2 months. Cash withdrawals from the ATM next to the Sunset Motel. Did you think I wouldn't notice? I was going to pay it back. With what money? The job you're about to lose when your boss realizes you've been committing timesheet fraud? The color drained from her face. You really sent those emails? I really did. Vic, please. We can work this out. I'll quit seeing Dan. I'll do whatever you want. But please don't destroy my career over this. I studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse, any acknowledgement of the depth of what she'd done. Instead, I saw panic about consequences and desperation to avoid accountability. Your career? I said slowly. Allison, you destroyed your own career when you decided to lie on your timesheets to cover up an affair. I just documented it. But why? Why did you have to involve other people? Why couldn't we handle this privately? And there it was. Even now, even after being caught red-handed, she was more concerned about her public image than the damage she'd done to our marriage. Because you didn't handle it privately. You involved your parents by using them as alibis. You involved Marcy by lying to her. You involved Dan's co-workers by having him pick you up at work. You involved our entire social circle by forcing me to pretend everything was fine while you made a fool of me behind my back. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Gloria's house. She was in her garden, probably hoping to catch a glimpse of more drama. You want to know the truth, Allison? I could have forgiven the affair. People make mistakes, marriages go through rough patches, sometimes these things happen. I turned back to face her. But I can't forgive the lies. I can't forgive the way you looked me in the eye every single day and made me feel crazy for suspecting what you were doing. I can't forgive the way you use people who love you as weapons against me. So what happens now? She asked. Now you figure out how to clean up the mess you made. And you do it somewhere else. You're throwing me out? I'm giving you the same consideration you gave me when you decided to have an affair, which is to say, none. She sat there for a long moment, and I could see her cycling through emotions, anger, desperation, calculation. Finally, she settled on what looked like resignation. I'll need time to find a place. You've got until tomorrow night. After that, I'm changing the locks. That's not enough time. Then you should call Dan. I'm sure he'll be happy to help, assuming he still has a job on Monday. She flinched at that, and I realized she hadn't considered that Dan might be facing consequences too. What did you send his boss? Everything. photos, timeline, documentation of him using company time and resources to conduct an affair with a married woman, plus some interesting information about his pattern of targeting married women specifically. His pattern? Did you really think you were special, Allison? Dan's been bragging to anyone who'll listen about his system for seducing married women. You were just another conquest in a long line of them. The look on her face told me she hadn't known that. Despite everything, despite the months of lies and deception, she'd actually believed their affair meant something to him. You're lying. I pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd made at the gym. Dan's voice filled the room, bragging about his married women, laughing about their boring husbands, describing his current conquest who told her husband she was helping her parents with house repairs. Allison listened to the entire thing in silence, her face growing paler with each word. When it finished, she was quiet for a long time. I need to pack, she said finally. Yes, you do. She stood up and walked toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, I am sorry. No, you're not, I said. You're sorry you got caught? There's a difference. She went upstairs, and I listened to her moving around in our bedroom, opening drawers and closets. After about an hour, I heard her on the phone, presumably with Dan, though I couldn't make out the words. Whatever conversation they were having, it didn't sound pleasant. At 6:30 p.m., she came downstairs with 2 suitcases and a defeated expression. I'll come back tomorrow for the rest of my things. Call first. I don't want any surprises. She nodded and headed for the door, then stopped one more time. What are you going to tell people? I almost laughed. Even now, she was worried about managing the narrative. I'm going to tell them the truth, Allison. You should try it sometime. She left without another word, and I watched through the window as she loaded her suitcases into a taxi. Apparently Dan wasn't available to help with the move. I poured myself a whiskey and sat down in my living room, surrounded by the sudden silence of a house that had been holding its breath for months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. Because while Allison was learning to live with the consequences of her choices, Dan Miller was about to discover that some boring husbands have very long memories and very creative approaches to problem solving. And unlike my wife's affair, my revenge was going to be perfectly legal, completely justified, and absolutely devastating. Monday morning brought news that was both expected and satisfying. Allison had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her timesheet discrepancies, and Dan Miller had been terminated immediately for conduct unbecoming and misuse of company resources. I learned this from Marcy, who called me at work with updates she'd gathered from her network of workplace gossips and social media stalking. Allison's been staying at the extended stay motel on Route 9, Marcy reported. Apparently Dan told her she couldn't stay with him because his lease doesn't allow overnight guests. And you believe that? I asked. Of course not. He's probably already moved on to his next conquest. But Allison's still acting like they're going to work things out. Poor Allison. Even now, she was clinging to the fantasy that her affair had been a great romance instead of a predictable pattern of manipulation. There's something else, Marcy continued. Gloria told me that Allison came by the house yesterday while you were at work, but she couldn't get in. I'd changed the lock Sunday morning, just as I'd promised. Allison's key no longer worked, and she'd apparently stood on the front porch for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to get inside. She left a note, Marcy said. Gloria saw her put it under your doormat. After work, I found the note exactly where Gloria had said it would be. It was written on hotel stationery in Allison's careful handwriting. Vic, I know you're angry, but we need to talk about dividing our things. I have a right to half of everything we bought together. I'll come by Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. to discuss this. Please be reasonable. Allison. I read the note twice, marveling at the audacity. She'd destroyed our marriage with months of lies and deception, but she still expected me to be reasonable about splitting our assets. That's when I decided it was time for the final act of this little drama. I called Eddie first, then Gloria, then a few other neighbors. I told them that Allison was coming by Wednesday evening to collect her things, and I might need witnesses to ensure everything stayed civil. Would they mind being available, just in case? Of course, they all agreed. Gloria practically volunteered to provide refreshments. Then I called Dan Miller. I'd gotten his number from his company's website before they scrubbed his profile. He answered on the third ring, sounding wary. Dan, it's Vic Harper, Allison's husband. There was a long pause. What do you want? I want to invite you to a meeting Wednesday night at 7 p.m. My house. Allison will be there to collect her things, and I think you should be there too. Why would I want to do that? Because you're going to want to hear what I have to say about your future. Are you threatening me? Not at all. I'm offering you an opportunity to minimize the damage you've done to yourself. Another pause. What kind of opportunity? The kind where you might still have a chance of finding another job in this town, or any town within 100 miles of here. You can't... Dan, I documented everything, your pattern of targeting married women, your boasts about manipulating them, your use of company resources to conduct affairs. That information is currently sitting in a folder on my desk, but it doesn't have to stay there. I let it sit for a beat, then told him, 7 p.m., Wednesday, don't be late, and hung up. By Wednesday, I'd staged my living room like a courtroom. Gloria arrived early with cookies, then Eddie, Pete, and Susan, and Jim from work. By 6:55, the seats were full, everyone pretending they came for support while secretly hoping for fireworks. At exactly 7, Allison showed up with Dan. They froze when they saw the crowd. Allison demanded to know what this was, and I told her, this is accountability. I explained I wanted witnesses because her relationship with the truth had been shaky. I laid out the file, dates, places, receipts, ATM withdrawals, and credit card charges from our joint money, motel rooms, dinners, gifts, things she bought for him. Allison tried to argue it was our money, and I calmly corrected her. Using shared funds in secret to finance an affair is still stealing. Then I turned to Dan and opened a thicker folder. I told the room what he really was, a man with a pattern, not a romance. Screenshots, statements, and a recording of him bragging about targeting married women and mocking their husbands. Allison stared at him like she was seeing a stranger for the first time. Finally, I made it simple and legal. I'd already sent everything to my lawyer and the proper authorities. No drama, no rumors, just documented facts. Allison would sign a settlement based on what she'd done, and Dan would stay away unless he wanted more attention from people paid to investigate fraud. Allison whispered that she hated me. I said quietly, "Good. Now you know what it felt like." I opened the door and told them both to leave. They walked out like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. When the door shut, the room exhaled. Gloria grinned, someone laughed, and for the first time in months, I laughed too. Not because I'd won, but because it was finally over. And the best part wasn't revenge. It was getting my self-respect back.